August 1944. A German woman collapses in the Texas dust, her skull cracking against sun-baked earth. Blood pools beneath her head. Around her, 11 others sway in the brutal heat, their gray uniforms hanging off skeletal frames like funeral shrouds. An American guard reaches for his rifle. This is it, they think. This is where the propaganda becomes reality. This is where mercy dies and the beatings begin. But then, a weathered cowboy steps forward, removes his hat, kneels beside the fallen woman, and whispers something that will shatter everything these prisoners believe about their captors. If you enjoy powerful untold stories from World War II, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community, exploring the most shocking, inspiring, and unexpected moments from history. Don't miss what happens next, because this story gets even more insane. What you're about to hear is true. Every word. 12 German women, enemy soldiers, captured in the smoking ruins of North Africa, shipped across an ocean thick with U-boats, delivered to a Texas prison camp surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. They expected torture. They expected starvation. They expected to die far from home in a land their leaders had taught them to fear. Instead, they got something far more dangerous than bullets. They got kindness. They got full plates. They got horses. And that simple act of human decency would do more damage to Nazi ideology than 1,000 propaganda leaflets ever could. By the time their story ends, these women will have ridden hundreds of miles across Texas rangeland. They will have sat at the same dinner table as their captors. They will have sung Christmas carols in a ranch house while their homeland burned. And they will have learned a truth that terrifies every totalitarian regime: the enemy is just people. Hungry, scared human people. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this impossible story begins. Early 1944, North Africa. The Afrika Korps is collapsing like a house built on sand. Field Marshal Rommel has already been recalled to Germany. His legendary desert army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, is now a shattered mess of burned-out tanks, abandoned supply dumps, and exhausted men stumbling through the sand with their hands above their heads. British and American forces are advancing so fast that some units are capturing entire German positions before the defenders even know they're surrounded. Trucks grind over battlefields that still smell of cordite and diesel. Bodies lie half-buried in drifting sand. Abandoned equipment rusts under the merciless sun. In this chaos, Allied forces sweep up everyone. Combat soldiers, yes, but also clerks, radio operators, medical personnel, cooks, mechanics, the entire support apparatus of a modern army. And among the thousands of prisoners herded into temporary camps, there are 12 women, 12 German women in uniform. Nurses who'd treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals, radio operators who'd transmitted orders across hundreds of miles of desert, clerks who'd managed supply paperwork. None had fired a weapon in combat, but all wore the uniform of Nazi Germany. All served the regime. All were now prisoners of war. And all were absolutely terrified. For years, they'd been fed a steady diet of propaganda about the Americans. Brutal, corrupt, savage. Joseph Goebbels' radio broadcasts painted a picture of American soldiers as barely civilized barbarians who would rape, torture, and murder any German who fell into their hands. In women's magazines published by the Reich, American POW camps were described as death factories where prisoners were worked until they dropped dead from exhaustion. One of the women, a nurse named Greta from Bavaria, would later write, "We believed we would be treated worse than animals. We thought we would never see our homes again. Some of us prayed for a quick death. That seemed kinder than what we imagined was coming." The irony was brutal. These women feared the very nation that was about to feed them better than their own collapsing military could. They trembled at the thought of American captivity, while their own government was rationing food so severely that German civilians were slowly starving. But they didn't know that yet. They only knew fear. American officers separated them from the male prisoners immediately. 12 women among thousands of men created obvious problems. Security problems, housing problems, logistical problems. The Geneva Convention had rules about POW treatment, but it was written assuming prisoners would be overwhelmingly male. Female prisoners were an edge case nobody had really planned for. The women were counted, photographed, questioned briefly through interpreters, and loaded onto trucks. They bounced across rutted desert roads toward a port on the Mediterranean coast. The port city stank of fish seawater, hot metal, and bunker oil. Massive ships lined the docks painted in dull gray camouflage patterns. They were marched up a gangway onto a converted transport vessel. Below deck, the air was thick and stifling. Hammocks swung in tight rows. Steel walls sweated with condensation. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with the salt tang of the sea. At night, the engines roared so loudly that conversation was impossible. The ship vibrated constantly, a deep thrumming that got into your bones and stayed there. Food came twice a day. White bread instead of the dark rye they knew. Thin soup. Coffee that tasted burnt and bitter. Portions were small by American standards, but larger than what many German civilians were receiving by 1944. The women, already thin from months of inadequate rations in North Africa, picked at the food suspiciously. Was it poisoned? A trick. They ate slowly, waiting for the pain or sickness they'd been told would come. It never did. The food was just food. Plain, institutional, boring food. But real. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. The convoy moved at the speed of its slowest ship, zigzagging constantly to avoid U-boat attacks. Sometimes the women were allowed on deck in small guarded groups. Salt wind slapped their faces. The sun reflected off endless gray water. They saw other ships on the horizon, dozens of them, all moving together in a massive formation. Lisa, a clerk from Stuttgart, stood at the rail one afternoon and tried to count the ships. She stopped at 30. There were more beyond the horizon. I realized then, she would write years later, that we had lost the war. Germany could never match this. We could never build this many ships, move this many men, coordinate this much power. We'd been lied to about everything. When land finally appeared, it didn't look like the war-torn coastline they'd left behind in Europe. No bombed-out buildings. No columns of smoke rising from burning cities. Instead, they saw a bustling American port with massive cranes reaching into the sky, warehouses lined up along busy docks, and behind it, all tall buildings standing intact and prosperous. From the port, they were loaded into special rail cars with barred windows. The train clattered inland steel wheels, beating a steady rhythm on the tracks. Through those barred windows, they saw an America that seemed impossible. Fields rolled past green and golden. Small towns flashed by with gas stations, cafes, and shop windows crowded with goods. At one station stop, Lisa pressed her face to the glass and stared at a butcher shop. There was more meat hanging in that window, she recalled, than I'd seen in 6 months in North Africa. And this was just a random small-town shop in the middle of nowhere America. The train traveled for days. The landscape changed slowly. Cities gave way to farms. Farms gave way to ranches. Trees changed shape. The air grew hotter, thicker. Signs were all in English, incomprehensible to most of them. At night, they watched lights from isolated farmhouses slide past in the darkness. Each lit window was proof that the war hadn't touched this land. No bombers had flown over these farms. No artillery had torn up these fields. Life here continued as if the war were happening on another planet. Finally, after traveling more than 1,000 miles inside the United States, the train slowed near a small Texas town called Hearne. When the doors opened, heat rushed in like a physical force. The air was thick and wet, smelling of mud, creosote from railroad ties, and something else they couldn't quite identify. Dust, dry grass, distance. An American officer with a clipboard read from his papers in flat bureaucratic English, 12 German female prisoners, non-combat personnel for transfer to Camp Hearne. They climbed down onto Texas soil. The platform was wooden and rough. The sun was brutal. In the distance, they could see low buildings, water towers, and the glint of barbed wire catching the light. Camp Hearne sat in the middle of Robertson County, about 15 miles from the nearest substantial town. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. Long rows of wooden barracks. A tall water tower. Guard posts at the corners. Up close, reality became clear. Barbed wire fences surrounded everything. Searchlights waited on tall poles. The main gate was reinforced steel. By August 1944, more than 4,000 German prisoners were held at Camp Herne. Most were men captured in North Africa and Italy. Combat soldiers, tank crews, infantry, artillerymen. The women were a tiny minority scattered in a separate section of the camp. Inside, the wire life followed strict military routine. Wake at dawn, roll call, breakfast of thin coffee and army bread. Work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, lights out. The guards were professional but distant. Rules were rules. Prisoners were prisoners. The Geneva Convention was followed, but there was no warmth in it. The women were assigned to light labor inside the camp, cleaning, laundry, food preparation. It was boring, repetitive work, but it was better than what they'd feared. No beatings, no torture, just endless grinding routine. But outside the wire, a different kind of crisis was building. Texas, in 1944, was rich in land, but desperately short of labor. More than 1 million Texans were in uniform, scattered across the world, fighting in Europe and the Pacific. On many farms and ranches, almost every able-bodied man between 18 and 35 was gone. Cotton fields went unpicked. Fences sagged and broke. Cattle wandered through gaps in the wire because there weren't enough hands to maintain the miles of fencing that made ranch life possible. One state agricultural report warned that without additional help, as much as 20% of some crops would be lost to rot in the fields. Tom Wheeler felt that crisis every single day. His ranch sprawled across 4,000 acres of Texas grassland north of Herne. Pasture, small crop fields, creeks lined with scrub trees. The work never ended. Mending fence, checking water tanks, moving cattle between pastures, treating sick animals, repairing equipment, cutting hay. The list went on and on and on. Before the war, he'd had help. His 2 grown sons, half a dozen hired cowboys. They'd kept the place running smoothly. By 1944, both sons wore army uniforms somewhere overseas. Most of his cowboys had gone to war plants or oil fields where the pay was better and the work didn't involve 12-hour days under the brutal Texas sun. Wheeler was practical. Weathered. A man with a sunburned neck, calloused hands, and more work than daylight hours. He didn't complain. Complaining didn't fix fences. But he was drowning in chores that wouldn't wait. When he heard in town that Camp Herne was making prisoner labor available, he listened carefully. The U.S. government ran a formal program. Farmers could apply through the county agent's office for POW labor. They'd get workers for a set number of hours each day. Armed guards came with them. Payment went to the government, not the prisoners. 80 cents per day per worker. Local newspapers carried small notices, prisoners available for agricultural labor. Apply at county agent's office. One hot afternoon, Wheeler stopped by that office. The room smelled of old paper and sweat. On a bulletin board among posters about war bonds and ration stamps, he saw something new. A typed sheet. 12 German women available for agricultural labor under strict supervision. He read it twice. Women. He'd heard about Italian and German men picking cotton and chopping wood across Texas. But women prisoners doing ranch work. That was unusual. That evening at home, he mentioned it to his wife Martha over a sparse dinner. Thin meat, homegrown vegetables, coffee stretched with chicory. Everything tasted of wartime rationing. Women doing ranch work, Martha asked. I need hands, Wheeler said simply. Right now, I don't have the luxury of being picky. The next week, he drove his truck to Camp Herne. Dust boiled up behind the tires. Beside him sat his foreman, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Dutch. His family had come from Bavaria 2 generations back, and he still spoke fluent German. At the camp gate, a guard checked their papers. The air smelled of sun-baked wood and cooking onions from the distant mess hall. Major Robert Stills, the camp commander, met them inside. His uniform was crisp, despite the heat. Stills explained the rules in a flat, careful voice. Work hours strictly limited. Guards always present. No private contact. No gifts. No favors. "They are enemy personnel," he said firmly. "Not guests." Finally, in the narrow shade beside a mess hall, Wheeler saw them. 12 women standing in a loose line. Their gray uniforms hung off skeletal frames like clothes draped over scarecrows. Cheekbones pushed sharp against thin skin. One woman's arm was in a makeshift sling. Another's hands trembled despite the still hot air. They looked less like workers and more like hospital patients who'd been forced out of bed too soon. Wheeler stared. This wasn't what he'd expected. These women couldn't do heavy ranch work. They could barely stand in the shade without swaying. Dutch spoke to them quietly in German. They answered with short words, tired voices barely above a whisper. "They say they're fit for work," Dutch translated. Wheeler studied them. He thought about his empty pastures, his broken fences, his cattle that needed moving. And he thought about how easily one of these thin women could collapse in the noon sun and die right there in his field. What came out of his mouth next surprised everyone, including himself. "Tell them," he said to Dutch, his voice quiet but firm, "they're too thin to work. They're too thin to work." 5 words that hung in the scorching Texas air like a verdict nobody expected. Tom Wheeler, a weathered rancher with more fences than farmhands, had just refused 12 German prisoners. Not because they were enemies, not because they were women, but because they looked like they'd collapse before sundown. In Fan Mout, we saw how these women survived. North Africa crossed the Atlantic and arrived at Camp Hearn expecting torture. Instead, they got something more dangerous. A cowboy who saw human beings where everyone else saw labor units. But Wheeler's mercy was about to crash headfirst into military regulations, army bureaucracy, and one very angry major who believed rules existed for a reason. Because here's the problem. Nobody mentioned the U.S. Army didn't have a protocol for too thin to work. Prisoners were classified as able-bodied or not. These 12 women had been cleared by Army doctors. On paper, they were fit for labor. Wheeler had just rejected government-approved workers based on his gut feeling. And that, as Major Stills was about to explain, was not how the system worked. "Mr. Wheeler," Major Stills said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "These women have been medically examined. They meet the requirements for light agricultural labor. If you're requesting POW workers, you don't get to pick and choose based on personal opinion." Wheeler stood his ground in the shadow of the mess hall hat in his weathered hands. Around them the camp buzzed with its usual rhythm. Guards walking perimeters, prisoners moving between barracks, the distant clang of the kitchen. But in this small pocket of shade, a confrontation was brewing that would challenge everything the prisoner program stood for. "Major, with respect," Wheeler said slowly, "you send these ladies into a Texas field for 8-10 hours under that sun, and you'll be writing casualty reports instead of work logs. That productive for you?" Still's jaw tightened. He was a career officer, a man who'd built his reputation on following procedures and maintaining order. The prisoner work program had strict guidelines developed by Washington, tested at camps across the country, and approved at the highest levels. Those guidelines didn't include provisions for ranchers with soft hearts. "The regulations are clear," Stills continued. "All able-bodied prisoners must perform productive labor. That's Geneva Convention. That's Army policy. That's federal law. I can't authorize special treatment because you think they need fattening up first." Behind Wheeler, Dutch shifted his weight. The 12 women stood motionless, understanding nothing of the English being spoken, but reading the tension in every rigid shoulder and clenched jaw. They'd seen men argue about their fate before. It never ended well for the prisoners. Wheeler tried a different approach. "How about this? You assign them to me. I sign for all 12. I'll use them for ranch work, but not heavy field labor. Not yet. Give me 6 weeks to build them up proper. Then they'll be worth more to everyone." 6 weeks! Stills almost laughed. "Mr. Wheeler, the harvest doesn't wait 6 weeks. Cotton's coming in now. Every farm in Robertson County is screaming for workers. I've got 4,000 prisoners in this camp, and I'm supposed to hold back 12 because you've got a feeling. Not a feeling, Major. Look at them." Stills did look. He saw thin women in loose uniforms. He also saw personnel files that said they'd been cleared for duty. He saw a system that worked because everyone followed the same rules. If he made exceptions for Wheeler, he'd have 50 other ranchers demanding the same treatment. "Request denied," Stills said flatly. "You can take them under standard terms or not at all." Wheeler put his hat back on. "Then I guess it's not at all." He turned to leave. Dutch followed. Behind them, the 12 women watched their last hope of escape from the camp's grinding routine walk away into the bright Texas morning. But Wheeler wasn't done. He just needed to change the battlefield. That evening, back at his ranch, Wheeler sat at the kitchen table with Martha and Dutch. The house smelled of beans and cornbread, simple food stretched by wartime rationing. Outside, crickets sang in the gathering dusk. "The Major's not wrong," Martha said quietly. "He's got rules to follow." "Rules that'll kill those women," Wheeler replied. "You didn't see them up close, Martha. One good week in the fields, and we'll be burying somebody." Dutch sipped his coffee, thinking. His family had come from Bavaria 2 generations back. He still remembered his grandmother's stories about the old country, about hard times, about neighbors helping neighbors, because that's what people did. "What if?" Dutch said slowly. "We don't ask the Major." Wheeler looked up. Go over his head. Not over, around. Dutch leaned forward. "You know Bill Crawford?" Wheeler nodded. Bill Crawford was a retired Army colonel who'd served in the First War and now lived in Houston. More importantly, Crawford sat on the state agricultural committee that coordinated POW labor assignments across Texas. "Crawford understands logistics," Dutch continued. "He understands that dead workers don't pick cotton. Maybe he understands that sometimes you have to break a rule to make the whole system work better." It was a gamble. Wheeler would be going around Stills, potentially making an enemy of the camp commander. But the alternative was watching those women get worked to death under regulations that looked good on paper but ignored reality. 2 days later, Wheeler drove to Houston. The trip took 4 hours over dusty roads. Crawford's office was in a government building that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The colonel was 73, white-haired, with sharp blue eyes that had seen the trenches at Belleau Wood. Wheeler explained the situation. The thin women, the inflexible regulations, the Major who couldn't see past the rules book. Crawford listened without interrupting. When Wheeler finished, the old colonel was quiet for a long moment. "You know what you're asking," Crawford finally said. "You're asking me to override a camp commander's decision. That's not supposed to happen. Chain of command exists for a reason." "I know that, sir. But," Crawford continued, "I've also seen what happens when regulations become more important than common sense. Lost good men that way in France. Watched officers follow bad orders because questioning authority felt wrong." He pulled out a file, scanned through papers. "Stills runs a tight camp. Good record, but tight camps can be brittle. Sometimes flexibility is strength." Crawford looked up. "Here's what I can do. I can authorize a 6-week conditional assignment. You take those 12 women, light duty only, building them up for future agricultural work. After 6 weeks, they get reassessed. If they're still not fit, they go back to the camp full-time. If they've improved, the assignment continues under standard terms." "That'll work," Wheeler said. "But understand this." Crawford's voice hardened. "If anything goes wrong, if one of them escapes, if there's any incident, it comes back on both of us. Stills will have every right to say we undermined his authority. Your reputation takes a hit. Mine does too." Wheeler nodded. "I understand the stakes." 3 days later, the authorization came through. Major Stills called Wheeler to the camp, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes burning with suppressed anger. "You went around me," Stills said quietly. "You went to Houston." "I went where I thought I could get a fair hearing," Wheeler replied. "Fair." Stills' voice was cold. "You got what you wanted. 6 weeks conditional assignment, light duty, building them up." He leaned forward. "But understand this, Mr. Wheeler. Those women are still my responsibility. If anything happens, if they're injured, if they're mistreated, If one of them so much as trips and breaks an ankle, I'll have army investigators crawling over your ranch like ants. And when they're done, you'll wish you'd just followed the regulations in the first place." "Fair enough, Major." "And one more thing." Still's jaw was tight. "This doesn't set a precedent. Every other farmer in this county follows standard procedures. You get your 6 weeks because someone in Houston thought it was worth the risk. Don't make them regret it." The next morning, a military truck arrived at Wheeler's ranch just after dawn. The air was cool, painted gold by the rising sun. 12 German women climbed down chains, clinking softly. They expected fields, tools, endless rows of crops. Instead, they saw a wide dirt corral fenced with rough boards. Inside stood 8 horses, already saddled, their coats shining brown, black, and cream in the morning light. Steam puffed from their nostrils in the cool air. The women froze. This made no sense. Horses were for officers, for cavalry, for people who mattered. Not for prisoners, not for women who'd been told they were barely worth feeding. Wheeler stood by the fence with Martha and 2 older ranch hands. Dutch translated as Wheeler spoke. "Today you won't go to the fields," Wheeler said. "First you'll learn to be around horses. Then, if you want, you'll learn to ride." The word "want" hit like electricity. Prisoners didn't get wants. Prisoners got orders. Yet here was this American cowboy asking what they wanted. The propaganda had promised brutality. This felt like a trap. One woman stepped forward. Her name was Greta. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. She spoke in German to Dutch. "She says she taught riding in Bavaria." Dutch translated. "Before the war." Wheeler nodded and led her toward a sorrel mare named Honey. The mare's coat was warm under the morning sun. Greta reached out slowly, her fingers hovering over the horse's neck like she was touching something forbidden. When her palm finally pressed against that smooth coat, she started crying, not loud, just silent tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. "I remembered," she would write later, "who I had been before I became a number." For the next 6 weeks, a pattern emerged. 6 days a week, the truck arrived at dawn. The women worked until early afternoon when Texas heat became dangerous. They stayed around the stables, grooming horses, cleaning stalls, mending leather, hauling hay and water. Real work, but work that allowed them to rest when needed to build strength, instead of breaking what little they had left. Martha came every day with cold lemonade in a glass jar. She showed them how to braid manes, how to sit taller in the saddle, how to laugh at small mistakes. She talked about her sons overseas, about her mother, who'd immigrated from Germany, with nothing but a trunk and a recipe book. The women began to fill out. Cheekbones softened. Hands steadied. Color returned to faces that had been gray with exhaustion and fear. By week 4, they were riding. Wheeler used lunge lines, at first long ropes that kept horse and rider moving in controlled circles. The women learned balance, learned to move with the animal instead of fighting it. Some learned faster than others, but all of them learned. Week 5. Lisa asked to try riding free. Wheeler saddled Pete, an old gelding who'd taught 3 generations of riders. Lisa climbed up with help, her legs shaking. Dutch repeated Wheeler's instructions in German. "Hold the reins here. Gentle squeeze with your legs to move. Pull back to stop. Pete wants to listen." Pete walked. Dust puffed under his hooves. At first, Lisa sat rigid, gripping too tight. Slowly, her shoulders dropped. Her back straightened. By the 3rd circle around the corral, she was smiling. "For a little time," she told Martha later, "I forgot I was a prisoner." By week 6, they were riding fence lines in groups of 2 or 3, always with a guard nearby. On paper, they logged hours of agricultural inspection. In practice, they were learning land and sky and a kind of freedom that no barbed wire could contain. News spread fast in Robertson County. Other ranchers came to watch. Some scoffed. Others were quietly impressed. Word also reached Camp Hearn, where Major Stills tracked every hour, every task, every report with the careful attention of a man waiting for failure. But failure never came. The women worked hard. No escapes, no incidents, no problems. Just steady progress from skeletal prisoners to healthy workers. When the 6 weeks ended, Colonel Crawford himself drove out to Wheeler's ranch for the reassessment. He watched the women ride, watched them handle horses with competence and care, watched them smile at Martha's jokes and respond to Wheeler's instructions with the focused attention of people who'd found purpose. Crawford pulled Stills aside. "Your assessment, Major." Stills watched the corral in silence. Finally he spoke. "They're fit for agricultural labor. Assignment can continue under standard terms." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Wheeler's crazy gamble had worked. That evening, as the truck carried the women back to camp, they sang quietly in German. Old folk songs about mountains and forests and home. The sound carried across the fields like an answer to the war that still burned across the ocean. But someone else was listening too. In the guard tower, a young private from Wisconsin wrote a letter home that night. He described German prisoners singing on a Texas ranch. Described women on horses, cowboys, teaching enemies to ride barriers, breaking down in ways no propaganda poster ever showed. That letter would travel through postal channels, through family conversations, eventually reaching a reporter in Chicago who specialized in human interest stories from the war. And when that story broke in print, everything would change again. Because mercy extended to the enemy wasn't just a local ranching decision anymore. It was a potential scandal, and scandals demanded response from people far more powerful than a camp commander or a retired colonel. The real battle was just beginning, not on the ranch, but in Washington. 6 weeks. That's all it took for Tom Wheeler to transform 12 skeletal German prisoners into healthy ranch workers. In Fawn Motte, we saw these women arrive at Camp Hearn expecting torture only to meet a cowboy who said they were too thin to work. In Fawn High, Wheeler gambled his reputation went around military bureaucracy and won approval for a radical experiment teaching enemy prisoners to ride horses instead of breaking them in cotton fields. Now those women rode fence lines across Texas rangeland, sang folk songs while grooming horses, and looked more like ranch hands than POWs. But when a young private's letter home reached a Chicago reporter, Wheeler's quiet act of mercy exploded into a national controversy. And the real enemy wasn't Nazi Germany anymore. It was Washington. The letter arrived at the Chicago Tribune offices in late September 1945. The reporter who opened it, a man named Robert Hayes, had built his career on human interest stories from the war. Heroic medics, brave nurses, soldiers writing home. Feel-good content that boosted morale and sold papers. But this letter was different. "Dear Mom," it began, "you won't believe what I'm seeing down here in Texas. German women, on horses, being taught to ride by American cowboys. They're prisoners, but they don't look like prisoners. They smile. They laugh. They eat at the same tables as our guys. One of them carved a wooden horse for the rancher. Mom, we're treating the enemy better than some of our own boys get treated in basic training." Hayes read it 3 times. His editor leaned over his shoulder. "Is this real?" the editor asked. "If it is," Hayes replied slowly, "it's either the most beautiful story of the war or the biggest scandal." 2 days later, Hayes was on a train to Texas. He arrived in Robertson County on a bright October morning. The air smelled of dust and distant cattle. Camp Hearn's public affairs officer, a tired captain named Morrison, met him at the gate with suspicion in every line of his face. "Mr. Hayes," Morrison said flatly, "this is a military installation. We don't give tours to reporters." "I'm not asking for a tour, Captain. I'm asking about a prisoner work program. 12 German women, a ranch north of here, horses." Morrison's jaw tightened. "That program is authorized and legal. I'm sure it is. But the American public might want to know we're teaching Nazi prisoners to ride while American boys are dying in the Pacific. That's a story, Captain. Question is whether you want to help me tell it accurately or let me tell it based on speculation." Morrison made a phone call, then another. Finally, he said, "You get 4 hours, Wheeler's Ranch, supervised visit. You talk to who we say you can talk to. Any deviation, we pull your access." That afternoon, Hayes stood at Wheeler's corral, watching something he'd never expected to see. German women in worn uniforms riding American horses across Texas pasture. They moved with competence and confidence. No chains. No visible guards, though Hayes noticed armed men positioned at strategic points. Martha Wheeler brought him lemonade. Tom Wheeler answered questions in short, careful sentences. The women, through Dutch's translation, told sanitized versions of their stories. Captured in North Africa. Treated well. Grateful for the work. But Hayes was a good reporter. He noticed things. The carved wooden horse on the mantel. The way Martha touched one woman's shoulder in passing a gesture of familiarity that went beyond guard and prisoner. The photograph tucked into the kitchen windowsill showing all 12 women standing with horses smiling. That evening, back in his hotel room, Hayes wrote 2 versions of the story. Version 1. American Compassion. How Texas Cowboys are rehabilitating enemy prisoners through honest work and human dignity. Version 2. Coddling the Enemy. German POWs get horseback riding lessons while American soldiers die. He stared at both headlines for a long time. Then he made his choice. The story ran on October 18, 1945, on the Tribune's front page. Hayes went with version 1. He wrote about Wheeler's practical wisdom about women transformed from skeletal prisoners to productive workers, about mercy as a weapon against totalitarian ideology. The response was immediate and explosive. Letters poured into the Tribune offices. Hundreds the first day, thousands by week's end. They split almost exactly down the middle. Half praised Wheeler. "This is what America means." One letter said, "We're strong enough to treat even enemies with dignity. That's why we'll win." Half condemned him. "My son died at Normandy," another wrote. "And you're telling me we're teaching his killers to ride horses. This is a disgrace." The story jumped newspapers. New York Times picked it up. Washington Post ran an editorial. Radio commentators debated it on evening broadcasts. Suddenly, 12 German women on one Texas ranch became a proxy for larger questions about American identity, military discipline, and the proper treatment of enemies. In Washington, those questions landed on desks that mattered. Congressman Martin Burke from Illinois read the Tribune story over breakfast in his Georgetown townhouse. Burke was 48, a former Army officer himself, and chairman of the House Subcommittee on Military Appropriations. He'd lost a nephew at Iwo Jima 3 months earlier. He picked up his phone and called the War Department. "I want a full investigation." Burke told a very unhappy colonel on the other end. "Prisoner work programs. Texas specifically. Camp Hearn. I want to know who authorized this, why it was authorized, and whether military resources are being diverted to provide recreation for enemy prisoners while our boys are still fighting." The colonel promised a report. Burke wasn't satisfied. "I want hearings, public hearings. The American people deserve to know how their tax dollars are being spent." 2 weeks later, Burke's subcommittee announced formal hearings on POW work programs. The date was set for December 1945. Tom Wheeler, Major Stills, and Colonel Crawford would all be called to testify. The news reached Wheeler via telegram. He read it standing in his kitchen, the paper trembling slightly in his calloused hands. Martha stood beside him. "They're going to make an example of you," she said quietly. "Maybe," Wheeler replied. "Or maybe we get to make a different kind of example." But the pressure was crushing. Local sentiment in Robertson County had always been mixed. Now it polarized completely. Half the town treated Wheeler like a hero. Half avoided him like he'd betrayed something fundamental. His fellow ranchers split the same way. Some came by to shake his hand. Others stopped returning his calls. One man Wheeler had known for 20 years crossed the street to avoid speaking to him in town. The women at Camp Hearn felt it too. Stills, under enormous pressure from above, tightened restrictions. The work program continued. Crawford's authorization was still valid, but the atmosphere changed. Guards became more formal. Inspection became more frequent. The joy that had begun to emerge over those 6 weeks started to curl back in on itself like smoke. Lisa would later write, "We felt we had done something wrong. We didn't know what. We only knew that happiness, even for prisoners, was apparently too much to ask. In mid-November, another complication emerged. A reporter from a German-language newspaper in Milwaukee traveled to Camp Hearn. This reporter, a German immigrant named Klaus Werner, had a different angle. Werner interviewed the 12 women with Major Stills present. His questions were sharp. Are you being forced to work? Are you given adequate rest? Is the food sufficient? Are you treated according to Geneva Convention standards? The women answered carefully. Yes to all questions. But Werner picked up on something else. He noticed how they talked about the ranch, about Martha, about horses, about feeling for brief moments like people instead of prisoners. Werner's story ran in 3 German-language papers across the Midwest. His angle was different from Hayes's. German women find humanity in captivity, the headline read. American cowboys prove Nazi propaganda wrong. This version of the story reached different audiences. German immigrant communities, German POWs in other camps, and through Red Cross channels and smuggled letters, eventually Germany itself. In the ruins of Berlin, in the makeshift government offices where the Reich's collapse was being managed, someone read about 12 women on a Texas ranch. The story was filed away, propaganda value minimal. The war was lost. Nobody cared about POWs in America anymore. But in other camps across America, German prisoners cared very much. The story spread through the prisoner network like wildfire. Camp to camp, barracks to barracks. Whispered in German during work details and evening recreation. In Texas, they teach the women to ride horses. In Texas, the Americans share their dinner table. In Texas, maybe the propaganda was wrong. It created a subtle shift, not dramatic, not rebellion, just a quiet recalculation of who the enemy really was and what it meant to be captured by Americans versus Russians or British. The shift showed up in camp reports. Escape attempts at several camps decreased. Work productivity increased slightly. Disciplinary incidents dropped. It was statistically minor, but culturally significant. One German officer, a former Luftwaffe pilot, held in a camp in Colorado, wrote in his diary, "If the Americans can show mercy to women in Texas, perhaps surrender is not the end we were taught to fear. Perhaps it is simply the end of fighting." Back in Texas, Wheeler prepared for Washington. He didn't have lawyers or speechwriters. He had the truth, his work logs, and a clear conscience. Martha helped him organize documents. Dutch drove to Houston to meet with Colonel Crawford and coordinate testimony. The women wanted to help, but couldn't. Prisoners didn't testify to Congress. They could only wait and hope that the mercy shown to them wouldn't destroy the man who'd shown it. On November 28th, 3 days before the hearing, Martha found Wheeler in the barn. He was repairing a saddle that didn't really need repair, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind worked elsewhere. "You're scared," she said. Not a question. "I'm angry," Wheeler replied. "We did the right thing. Built them up so they could actually work. Saved the government from medical costs and bad publicity. And now I'm going to Washington to be called soft on the enemy by men who've never seen what war actually does to people." Martha sat beside him on a hay bale. "Then tell them that. Tell them what you saw. Tell them what changed. Tell them why mercy isn't weakness." Wheeler looked at his wife. "What if they don't listen? Then at least we'll know we tried." On December 1st, 1945, Tom Wheeler walked into a hearing room in Washington, D.C. The room smelled of wood polish and importance. Reporters packed the gallery. Congressman Burke sat at the center of a long table flanked by other committee members. Cameras flashed. Wheeler wore his best suit, which still looked like a rancher's best suit, clean, but worn, practical, but uncomfortable. He sat at a witness table facing the committee. An American flag hung behind Burke. The symbolism was clear. Patriotism on one side, Wheeler on the other. Burke began with statistics. "Mr. Wheeler, according to War Department records, you received 12 German POWs for agricultural labor in August 1945. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. And instead of putting them to work immediately, you spent 6 weeks teaching them recreational horseback riding. Is that correct?" Wheeler's jaw tightened. No, sir. That's not correct. Burke looked up, surprised. You denied teaching them to ride. I deny it being recreational, Wheeler said firmly. I taught them to work. Riding is how we check fences on 4,000 acres of rangeland. It's how we move cattle. It's how we cover ground that would take 20 men on foot to inspect. Those women learned a job skill. They became productive workers. That was the entire point. But you delayed their productivity for 6 weeks. I delayed them dying in my fields for 6 weeks, Wheeler shot back. Sir, with respect, those women were starving. Not thin. Starving. You put them in a cotton field on day 1, and somebody collapses. Maybe dies. Then what? Then the Army writes a report about negligent treatment of prisoners. Then you're holding hearings about why we killed German POWs through forced labor. I prevented that. Burke shuffled papers. The Army doctors cleared them for light duty. Army doctors aren't responsible for what happens at noon in a Texas field, when it's 105 degrees and a woman who weighs 90 pounds is carrying a sack of cotton. I am. The room was quiet. Burke tried another angle. Mr. Wheeler, do you believe these women deserved special treatment? I believe they deserved not to die. If that's special treatment, then yes. But American soldiers in POW camps. Wheeler interrupted, his voice rising. Don't you dare compare American boys in Japanese camps to what we did. We fed those women. We didn't torture them. We gave them honest work and basic humanity. That's not coddling. That's being American. Burke's face reddened. Another committee member, a younger congressman from Texas named Howard, leaned forward. Mr. Wheeler, Howard said more gently, I think what concerns this committee is the perception. Horseback riding, shared meals, gifts exchanged. It looks soft. Wheeler took a breath. Congressman, I'm a rancher. I deal with reality, not perception. The reality is 12 women arrived at my ranch looking like they'd escaped from a grave. 6 weeks later, they were healthy, strong, and productive. They've since logged over 800 hours of agricultural labor. They've helped me keep my ranch running while my sons are overseas. That's not soft. That's smart. But the horses, our tools? Wheeler interrupted again. Like tractors, like trucks. You don't apologize for teaching someone to drive. Why apologize for teaching them to ride? Colonel Crawford testified next. He backed Wheeler's account completely, provided statistics, showed logs, demonstrated that the program had worked exactly as intended. Major Stills testified reluctantly. He admitted the program succeeded, but maintained that proper channels should have been followed. Mr. Wheeler went around my authority, Stills said. That sets a dangerous precedent. But it worked, Howard pressed. The women became productive. No incidents. No escapes. Yes, Stills admitted. It worked. The hearing lasted 6 hours. By the end, Burke's anger had cooled into something more like grudging respect. The committee recessed to deliberate. They issued their findings 3 days later. The program was deemed unorthodox, but not improper. Wheeler was officially cleared of wrongdoing. Colonel Crawford's authorization was upheld. The work program could continue. But the report added a caveat. While we find no violations of military regulation or Geneva Convention standards, we caution against programs that may create perception of preferential treatment toward enemy prisoners. Appearances matter in maintaining public confidence in military discipline. Wheeler read the report in his kitchen. They're saying I did nothing wrong while telling everyone to never do it again, he said. But you won, Martha replied. The women stay. The program continues. For now, Wheeler said. Until the next politician needs a headline. He was right. Over the next 3 months, as 1945 turned into 1946, the scrutiny intensified rather than faded. Every ranch using POW labor in Texas faced increased inspection. Guidelines were tightened. Programs that had run informally for years suddenly required mountains of paperwork. But Wheeler's specific program survived. The 12 women continued riding fence lines, working stables, helping with cattle. The difference was, now the whole country was watching. And in that watching, something unexpected happened. Other camps began quietly adopting similar approaches. Not formal programs, just practical adjustments. Building up prisoners before heavy labor, recognizing that healthy workers produced more than broken ones. Using appropriate tools including horses for appropriate jobs. Nobody called it the Wheeler method. Nobody wrote official policies. But across the American POW system, small changes rippled outward from one ranch in Texas, where a cowboy had refused to work 12 starving women to death. By March 1946, the war in Europe had been over for nearly a year. Germany was occupied. The prisoner repatriation process began. Soon the 12 women would return home to whatever remained of their lives. But before they left, they would have one more night under Wheeler's roof. One more meal. One more chance to say goodbye to the horses and the land and the people who'd shown them that enemies could choose mercy. That story comes in Fawn Bon, the ending you didn't expect, the legacy that outlasted the war, and the question that still echoes across decades. What does it mean to win not just a war, but the peace that follows? From a dusty Texas corral to the halls of Congress, we've followed an impossible journey. Tom Wheeler, a practical rancher with calloused hands and a clear conscience, looked at 12 starving German prisoners and said 5 words that changed everything. "You're too thin to work." He taught them to ride instead of breaking them in cotton fields. He fought military bureaucracy, survived Washington hearings, and proved that mercy wasn't weakness, it was strategy. But the real story doesn't end with congressional vindication or successful work programs. The real story ends with what happened when those women went home, what Wheeler's gamble cost him, and what it taught America about winning wars and keeping humanity. Because sometimes the greatest victories have nothing to do with battles. March 1946. The repatriation orders came through like clockwork. Germany was occupied, divided, and beginning the long process of rebuilding from total devastation. Across America, over 400,000 German POWs were being processed for return. Camp Hearn was no exception. The 12 women received their orders on a cold morning. Departure date, April 15, 1946. Destination Bremen, Germany, then dispersal to whatever remained of their hometowns. They had 6 weeks to say goodbye to Texas. Wheeler insisted on one final meal. Not a formal dinner this time, just a simple supper at the ranch house on the evening of April 14th. Martha cooked all-day roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from the last of the canned harvest, fresh bread, and apple pie made from fruit she'd been saving. The women arrived just before sunset. The truck rolled up the familiar dirt road for the last time. They climbed down without chains that small dignity had been won months ago. The evening air smelled of dust and distant mesquite smoke. Inside the house, the table was set for 15. Wheeler, Martha, Dutch, the 2 ranch hands, and all 12 women. The fire crackled. Candles burned. For 3 hours they ate and talked and laughed and cried. Greta gave Wheeler a second carved horse, this one more detailed than the first. "For when you forget us," she said through Dutch's translation. "I won't forget." Wheeler replied simply. Lisa handed Martha a letter written in careful English. "For your sons," it said at the top. "Thank their mother for showing us that Americans are not what we were told." Anna had drawn a picture, 12 women on horseback under a wide Texas sky. No guard towers, no barbed wire, just open land and freedom, even if that freedom was temporary. When the evening ended, they stood in a circle outside under the stars. The same stars that shone over the ruins of Germany. The same stars that would guide these women home to whatever waited there. "You gave us back our lives," Greta said. "We were dying, not just from hunger, from fear, from believing we were less than human. You showed us we were wrong about America, about people, about what enemies can choose to be to each other." Wheeler nodded, his weathered face unreadable in the dim light. "You worked hard. You earned everything you got here." The next morning, the truck came early. This time, it would take them to the train station, then to the port, then across the ocean to a homeland most of them barely recognized anymore. They climbed into the truck bed one last time. As it pulled away, they turned to watch the ranch disappear behind them, the corral, the stable. the house where they'd eaten Christmas dinner and felt like people instead of prisoners. Martha stood beside Wheeler at the gate until the dust settled and the road was empty. "Do you think we'll ever hear from them again?" she asked. "I hope so," Wheeler said. "But even if we don't, we did right by them. That's enough." He was wrong about not hearing from them. Letters came. Slowly at first, then steadily for decades. Greta made it back to Bavaria. Her family's stable had been destroyed, but she rebuilt it from rubble with her own hands and borrowed money. By 1950, she was teaching children to ride again. In a letter dated 1953, she wrote, "Every time a child sits a horse for the first time, I remember Texas. I remember that even in war, some people choose kindness. I try to be that kind of person now." Lisa's journey was harder. Stuttgart was a wasteland of broken stone and burned-out buildings. Her father was dead. Her mother had survived, but was sick and frail. Lisa trained as a teacher and worked with war orphans' children who'd lost everything. She taught them English using phrases she'd learned at the ranch. "You're doing fine," she'd tell them in English. "Keep trying." In 1958, she wrote, "I teach them more than language. I teach them that enemies can become friends, that Americans showed me mercy when I deserved none, that the world can be rebuilt with kindness." Anna became an artist. Her paintings from the late 1940s and 1950s showed German women on horseback, always with a Texas landscape in the background. Guard towers appeared in some paintings, but always distant, always fading. Her work hung in galleries in Munich and Stuttgart, quietly asking viewers to reconsider what they thought they knew about captivity and freedom. She never sold the original drawing she'd given Martha, she made prints instead. "That one was personal," she said. 3 of the 12 women eventually married American soldiers during the occupation and immigrated legally to the United States. One settled in California, another in Wisconsin. The third came back to Texas just 2 counties over from Robertson County. She visited Wheeler's ranch in 1959. By then, Wheeler was 70, still working the land, but slower, more tired. They sat on the porch drinking lemonade, and she told him about her life. Her American husband, her 2 children, her small house with a garden. "Do they know?" Wheeler asked. "Your kids, do they know you were a prisoner?" "They know I came here during the war," she said. "They know a Texas cowboy taught me to ride. They know I was scared and he was kind. That's enough for now. When they're older, I'll tell them the rest." Wheeler died in 1963, 74 years old, working his land until the week before his heart gave out. The funeral was large. Ranchers from across the county, old army buddies, friends from town, and 3 German women who'd flown in from across the country to say goodbye to the man who'd refused to work them to death. The local newspaper ran an obituary that mentioned his war work with POWs. It was 2 paragraphs in a story mainly about his ranching career. Most people in Robertson County never knew the full story. It wasn't something Wheeler talked about much. He'd done what he thought was right, then moved on with his life. Martha lived until 1982. Among her papers, her children found over 60 letters from German women, some in German, some in English, all expressing gratitude that had lasted decades. They found photographs, the carved horses. Anna's drawing now faded but carefully preserved. The children donated everything to the Robertson County Historical Museum. It sits there today in a small exhibit about POW camps in Texas. Most visitors walk past it quickly, not understanding what they're looking at. But Wheeler's real legacy isn't in a museum. It's in policy. After the congressional hearings in 1945, the Army didn't officially adopt the Wheeler method. They couldn't. It would mean admitting their initial approach had been flawed. But quietly over the next year, guidelines for POW work programs changed. New provisions required medical assessment not just for eligibility, but for work intensity. Prisoners were to be built up to full labor capacity, not thrown into it immediately. Work programs were evaluated not just on hours logged, but on prisoner health outcomes and long-term productivity. None of the new regulations mentioned Wheeler by name, but people who worked in the system knew. The changes rippled out from Texas across the entire American POW network. By the time the Korean War brought new prisoners into American custody, the lessons had been absorbed. POWs were treated as assets to be maintained, not just labor to be extracted. The result was better intelligence cooperation, fewer escape attempts, and lower operational costs. During Vietnam, the approach evolved further. The 1949 Geneva Convention updates incorporated principles that Wheeler had stumbled into through practical necessity, that prisoners were human beings whose treatment reflected on their captors, that mercy could be strategic, that enemies today might be allies tomorrow. Modern military training includes case studies of POW management. Wheeler's story appears in some of those studies, usually without his name. Just a rancher in Texas during World War II who demonstrated that appropriate treatment of prisoners yields better outcomes than harsh exploitation. The numbers tell the story. Of the roughly 425,000 German POWs held in America during World War II, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Compare that to British or Russian camps, where escape attempts were far more common. The American approach, decent food-fair treatment work that wasn't deliberately cruel, created an environment where prisoners had less motivation to risk their lives escaping. After the war, many German POWs who'd been held in America spoke positively about their treatment. Some returned as immigrants. Others became unofficial ambassadors for American values in rebuilt Germany. That soft power, that positive impression paid dividends during the Cold War when West Germany became a crucial NATO ally. Wheeler couldn't have known any of this. He just saw 12 starving women and made a practical decision. But that single decision, multiplied across thousands of small choices by other Americans in similar positions, helped shape post-war Germany's relationship with America. But the lesson isn't really about POW policy. The lesson is about systems and innovation, and the courage to say, this doesn't make sense, even when everyone else says it does. Military organizations, like all large institutions, resist change. Regulations exist for good reasons, but they calcify. They become sacred. They stop serving their purpose and start serving themselves. Wheeler wasn't trying to innovate. He was trying to solve a problem. The innovation came from seeing the problem clearly instead of seeing the regulation. How many times in history has good policy failed because someone followed the letter of the law while ignoring its spirit? How many disasters could have been prevented if someone had said, I know what the rules say, but the rules are wrong in this situation? The same pattern appears throughout military history. Billy Mitchell, advocating for air power in the 1920s, ridiculed until Pearl Harbor proved him right. John Boyd, developing energy maneuverability theory in the 1960s, fighting the Pentagon every step of the way. Norman Borlaug, bringing agricultural science to famine regions opposed by experts who said it couldn't work. In every case, someone with practical experience saw a better way. In every case, the system resisted. In every case, reality eventually won, but only because someone was willing to fight the system long enough for reality to become undeniable. Wheeler fought for 6 weeks before getting authorization. Mitchell fought for 20 years. Boyd fought his entire career. The timescale varies, but the pattern doesn't. Today, in boardrooms and laboratories and military planning sessions, the same battles play out. Someone has an idea that challenges conventional wisdom. The system says no. The question is whether that person has enough courage, enough evidence, and enough stubbornness to keep pushing until no becomes maybe, becomes yes. Wheeler had all three, and because he did, 12 women lived who might have died. Hundreds of other prisoners benefited from policy changes his example inspired. And decades later, former enemies remembered America not for its bombs or its soldiers, but for a cowboy who saw people instead of numbers. There's one detail most people don't know. In 1961, 2 years before Wheeler died, the West German government quietly awarded him a civilian medal, the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. It was a low-grade honor, not widely publicized. The citation mentioned contributions to German-American friendship during a difficult period. Wheeler never told anyone about it. His children found the medal in a drawer after he died, still in its presentation box. He'd received it, put it away, and continued fixing fences. That's the most Wheeler thing imaginable. No drama, no speeches. Just do the work, do it right, then move on. From a weathered rancher with more fences than farmhands, to a quiet hero whose mercy changed policy and saved lives. Tom Wheeler proved that doing right isn't complicated, it just requires seeing clearly and acting courageously. Over 400,000 German POWs passed through American camps, but 12 women on a Texas ranch taught us that the strongest weapon isn't the one that kills the most enemies. It's the one that turns enemies into people. And in that transformation lies the only victory that actually lasts.